Richard Niles. What's going on? I'll tell you. My rare and historically significant interview with legendary Motown arranger David Van DePitte, recorded for my BBC Radio 2 documentary series in 2002. Although not as widely recognized as some of his peers, David Van DePitte's contributions were crucial in shaping the sound that distinguished Motown in the 1970s. His work continues to inspire arrangers and producers across genres. He passed away in 2009 at the age of 74. So listen now and enjoy our interview, a rare view from the shop floor of Motown's production line, working with Marvin Gaye, Gordy, producers such as Frank Wilson, and musicians such as his friend James Jamerson. No one with soul will want to miss this. Now, let's get it on. That seems like, I don't know that much about it, but it seems like it was a very different experience for you.
Yeah, well, the Let's Get It On project per se, I had very little to do with, except I guess you'd call it the B side of the record. There's about 4 cuts on there that were originally done for the group called the Originals. Marvin and I recorded them for the Originals. And Marvin went out to the West Coast and was living out there and decided to do another album. Did not include me in the process, but did put those 4 songs with his own voice, of course, having been overdubbed, on the B side of the album. And I found out after the fact, of course, that Let's Get It On was done, and didn't quite understand the process until later on when I was told that Marvin suspected me of, how would I say it, being a little too musical for his taste. He was afraid that what I was going to do was take over his credits or something like that. It was a little bit paranoid in my estimation, but while we liked each other, apparently he disliked me to some degree, and I never knew about it till after the fact. Interesting.
Well, now this has happened to me before, so I'm going to ask you, do you think the fact that you got credit for what's going on and people then started saying, yeah, Marvin, great record, and wow, those arrangements, so that you were getting some compliments for that, do you think that's why he was later quoted in the David Ritz book saying, well, I never wanted him to have credit in the first place?
Yeah, because he was purporting the theory that, and I believe he states someone, and I'll paraphrase out of that same book, every note of this album was in my head. I just needed to get it on paper or something to that effect, which of course was silly, because when I showed up, not all the tunes were even finished. So that's an impossibility. And I think maybe being nominated for a Grammy didn't help too much. Sometimes when you're dealing with egos, it's difficult. I don't have a problem with that, but other folks seem to.
Yeah, well, I've spoken to a lot of arrangers on this project, and they all agree that we need the skills of harmony, counterpoint, and diplomacy.
Yes. Boy, have you hit it on the head. I think that an arranger is 99.9% diplomat. The rest, maybe musician, but honestly, you're absolutely right. Diplomacy is one of the biggest things in our trade. You really have to, in order to get to understand what people are looking for and what kind of end product they're looking for, you really have to be able to get into their heads a little bit and understand many times in non-musical terms, because they're not musical people necessarily, what they're trying to accomplish. And you learn the diplomatic approach very early on, trying to be as diplomatic as possible in order to obtain information that you can use to enhance the final product, and get as close to what they were looking for as possible. As an arranger, as you well know, you're diplomatic to producers, to various and sundry company officials. You're also diplomatic to musicians because you depend on them to recreate your notes on paper for you. And nothing would be worse than to have a room full of angry musicians out of which you're trying to get a product. That's the silliest thing I can think of. So you definitely want to be a diplomat, absolutely. And you can't afford to offend too many clients because we don't have that many. There aren't any. They've gone away.
Can you give some example, perhaps, of a rather emotional moment in the studio or a difficult moment in the studio that you were able to diffuse?
Oh my. There have been many over the years. To cite one specifically might be a little bit difficult at a moment's notice, but I can remember times down at Motown when the musicians would have been there recording a particular tune for some producer who was not very musical at all, I guess would be the fair thing to say. And they would sit there and require a take after take after take of the same tune and never explain to the musicians why it was that they were doing another take. And if you say, gee, the guitar was out of tune, everyone understands that. And they're happy to do another take because the guitar was out of tune. Or possibly you can, like we do today, we can just overdub the guitar and fix it. But when you constantly say, well, that was okay, but would you do another take for me? Well, why? If it was okay, why are we doing another take? And the tempers would start to boil. It was a small room with a lot of people in it. And I've seen Jamerson actually put his bass down and just storm out, come back a few minutes later and say, okay, we got this all together now. Can we make a take? Because he knew that we had to take maybe take three or take two. And here we are at take 41. So, I mean, that kind of thing, we're not constantly. Oh, I never saw it ever come to any serious fisticuffs or anything, but it got out of hand.
Now, going back to the Let's Get It On album, you've got writing credit on 4 tracks, 3 of which are on the deluxe edition that's been released,
Yeah.
none of which were finished. Can you tell us a little bit about working on that album?
Yes. Now, what you're referring to is not the Let's Get It On album, but that was an additional album that Marvin and I did that was never released until just recently. A few of the tracks, as you're pointing out, had been released. The reason being that they were never completed. But what happened is that after the Let's Get It On album, I got a call from the company out of the West Coast here in the States, and they said, please come out to California and do another album with Marvin. We need another album from Marvin, blah, blah. And I said, well, quite frankly, I don't think Marvin wants to work with me. I mean, he's obviously gone on to other things. He's done another album in between, and he's worked with someone else. So I don't know how this will work. And they said, well, frankly, we don't care how it works. Just come out and do it. We'll worry about putting it together later. Okay. So I ended up going to the West Coast and we sat and talked for a little while, Marvin and I. And I said, well, Marvin, what's the deal? And he said, well, they are requiring me to do an album and I don't really want to do it, but I guess I'm going to have to. And I said, well, then, let's put a good face on it and let's try to do a really nice product. We did one, we can do another. So we sat and literally composed the thing together in this particular case. It was he was staying at some motel somewhere and we got a little portable piano and he and I sat there and banged on the piano and traded ideas and came up with a concept and what have you and started writing tunes. And got to the point where we went in and recorded the rhythm tracks. Then I don't remember exactly. I think there were about 8 tunes that were recorded. I'm not positive of that, but I think it was about 8 tunes. And then I put strings and horns on them and some percussion, and all of a sudden Marvin disappeared, and it was not to be found. And the company didn't know where he was, and everybody was out scouring the countryside looking for Marvin, who, as it turns out, had rented a camping vehicle and gone out into the desert or something, and I don't know, some bizarre thing, and just got lost. I mean, he just didn't want to be bothered and didn't want to finish the project. Well, that was really a bad deal because here I was not only co-writer but co-producer of an album that was never going to be finished. It really, really, really made me angry. So I stormed into the company and I said, "What in the world are we going to do about this? We can't put a gun to the guy's head and force him to come and sing this stuff. I mean, but yet the album is virtually done. All he has to do is show up and sing." And put some backgrounds, in and things like that. I mean, but the bulk of the work was done. Well, it was never finished. And I guess from what I find out now, because of the re-release, he had gone in and experimented with some vocals on some of the stuff. And that was unbeknownst to me because I was back on the East Coast again and had no idea that he was even involved in the project. I assumed it was sitting on a shelf somewhere collecting dust. Our dear friend Harry Weingart found the stuff and called me one day and said, guess what I found? And I said, what would that be? And Harry said, I found these tracks that Marvin was working on, and I understand you had something to do with. He said, and when I listened to him, he said, it sounds like you all over the place. So I said, oh my God, Harry, you found the lost album. Which indeed he had. I had been telling people for years that we had done another album, and of course they said, yeah, right, sure you did, because it never saw the light of day, and no one could imagine that there would be a Marvin Gaye album sitting in a can somewhere, never seeing the light of day. He was too marketable, you know.
Yeah, well, the fact that you can laugh at it now shows what a grand fellow you really are, especially since you're quoted on the record as saying this is some of your best work ever.
Indeed.
And from those 3 tracks, we get a tantalizing glimpse of that work.
Yeah.
Have you ever been tempted to go in the studio and finish them?
Well, not that I'm aware of. I don't know. I'd like to talk to Harry Wangert about that one day and see if maybe something couldn't be done along those lines. I don't know what could be, but there may be something. It would be an interesting idea.
Now, in a situation like that, you as the producer arranger are completely at the mercy of the personality of the artist, which in this case was not exactly totally what might be called stable. So my question is, do you think that it's the record company's fault here by giving too much control to a personality like that?
Well, yes, I think that could be part of the problem. In this particular case, in speaking of Marvin particularly, he was looking for control only because he had not ever had any control over what he ultimately wanted to do and perform. And he'd been dictated to by for so long that I think he just got fed up with it and said, "Done it. Let me do my own thing for once. Just give me a break here. He never wanted to be a teeny bopper kind of singer. He wanted to be a more serious kind of a singer, and he just wasn't really given the chance that he wanted to do whatever it was that he dreamed he should be doing. And by sort of giving him that much control, I think that they kind of lost the ball. They kind of dropped the ball on the one hand. On the other hand, I felt that he should have more control only because he had really something to say that they may not have been particularly interested in listening to, but they should have at least given him the chance. If they had put something on record and then said, well, Marvin, quite reasonably, this will not sell. This is not a marketable product, or some such argument, that was reasonable. He probably would have listened to them. But with it relative to my position, I thought that at this point in time, being co-producer and co-songwriter on this particular album would give me some kind of clout, of course. And as it ends up, it didn't. So who knows?
Well, it was a tragedy, of course, in some ways, but there are still people like myself who recognize your work and are big fans.
Well, thank you very much.
Well, we're going to have to sadly wrap it up right now, but thank you so much for talking to us today.
Excellent, Richard. Well, it was an extreme pleasure, and I thank you for taking the time. It was wonderful. I enjoyed it very, very much.
Well, so did I, and I can only close by saying, most respectfully, Dave, you the man.
Why, thank you, Richard, very much. And thanks again for the album. I do appreciate it and love it. Absolutely. And thank you very, very much. Right. Bye-bye now.
Shake it, baby, shake it up.